Tonight on Nation to Nation, the federal government appears to be making good on its promise to close the funding gap on child welfare and Jordan's principle. But Cindy Blackstock says there's still a lot of work to be done.
We still have issues with education, early childhood, basics like water and sanitation that are going to continue to pile up on hopes and dreams of children.
On Tuesday, BC's finance minister announced that province's support for an Indigenous law program at the University of Victoria. One of its law professors hopes it will change attitudes.
There won't be this absence as if Indigenous peoples were somehow lawless, as if our societies and our peoples did not govern ourselves lawfully.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. Hello, I'm Todd Lamarand. There is an inequality in Canada when it comes to child welfare. There's a wide difference between on-reserve and off-reserve funding. A human rights tribunal agreed in 2016, but it has taken 5 legal orders for the government to do something. Earlier this month, Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott announced an immediate end to the gap, set up a 24/7 1-800 helpline, and promised more funding in next week's federal budget. The one person who has been fighting on the side of the children for more than a decade is Cindy Blackstock, the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. She joins me now to talk about recent developments and the future. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, after what happened earlier this month, are we finally seeing some light at the end of the tunnel?
I think we're seeing a little glimmer of light, but my view, as it's always been, is I have zero tolerance for inequities in services for First Nations children. I believe every one of our kids is sacred and every one of our kids is worth the money. And although we're starting to see, thanks to the tribunal's work and all of the First Nations communities and families and children who have advocated and stood with us during this long court battle, some inequality starting to close in child welfare and on Jordan's principle, we still have issues with education, early childhood, basics like water and sanitation that are going to continue to pile up on hopes and dreams of children. So I want to see Canada adopt the Spirit Bear Plan and put an end to all of these inequalities and take the same approach I do, which is zero tolerance for any racial discrimination against little kids in public service provision.
So when you're talking about zero tolerance, obviously, I guess after the latest announcements by Philpott, you still don't think the government is quite in compliance with what the Human Rights Tribunal spelled out?
Well, I want to see what's actually in that budget. And I also want to see when the First Nations agencies send in their invoices for family support, I want to make sure that the government actually pays that in full instead of trying to nickel and dime it, as we've seen in the past. So I think there's some hope on the horizon, but as always, I measure hope at the level of children. I want to see changes happen for those children and families. And when we start to see that in a positive way, then I'll start to feel really encouraged.
Of course, Minister Philpott has promised to pay those invoices. It is still too early to determine whether that's happening?
I think it is, because the First Nations agencies only received a letter saying that they could bill for these services as of February 1st. So they would just be starting that process of billing, because normally they bill every month. So they'll be starting that process, and we'll start to see whether or not that actually is going to happen in reality.
Now, of course, there's been reports in the media that Philpott has talked to the Minister of Finance and is going to get a positive response from him when it comes to next week's budget. Are there specific things you're hoping to see in that budget?
Yeah, I want to see the Spirit Bear Plan actualized. I want to see them not only deal with the inequalities in child welfare and make a commitment that no matter how much it costs to end this inequality, that they're committed to do it, right? And I also don't want to see the money spread over 10 years or 5 years like we've seen in the past with the biggest investments in the back end. I want to see the biggest investments in kids right now, because they're growing up right now, right? They need those inequalities to end in child welfare right now. In addition to that, I'll be looking for investments in early childhood programs. That you saw that report that only 18% of kids get benefit from Aboriginal Head Start. It should be 100% of kids who have the option of going to Aboriginal Head Start. And then also the Parliamentary Budget Officer, as you know, Todd, did that review of education and found out even after all the investments for education in budget 2016 are accounted for, our kids are still getting less, and the gap in the condition of schools continues. So I'd like to see how they're going to fix that fully too.
Do the provinces need to come on board? We just saw a budget earlier this week from the BC budget, and they kicked some money, a few $100 million into, of course it was for everybody in the province, not just Indigenous. There was some money for example, for Head Start in that province. but we need to see other provinces doing what they did.
Yeah, and I'd like to see the provinces adopt the Spirit Bear Plan. I mean, many of our community members live off reserve, and they need access to culturally based services that meet the distinct needs of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children and their families. I think the provinces really have not stepped up to the plate at the degree that they could. And they're failing to understand that, yes, it's going to cost a bit more in a short time, but every dollar you invest in a little child saves the government $20 downstream. And let's face it, how wonderful would it be if we saw the first generation of Métis, First Nations, and Inuit kids grow up healthy and proud of who they are without having to spend their whole childhoods fighting for equality. That would be a great day.
Now, of course, we've had these conversations with you many times about the inequality between on and off reserve. Mm-hmm. But off reserve, there's obviously a lot of inequality there. I mean, what's not being done, I suppose, to help those people in particular?
Well, when we look at child welfare in general, off reserve, the vast majority of children in care are First Nations kids, then Métis and Inuit children. But when we look at the services that they're providing, they're mainstream services. They're not adapted to those needs. There's also not an accounting of the housing conditions off reserve, or the availability of addiction services to get over the multi-generational trauma of residential schools. All of that has to be taken into account in the design of child welfare services off reserve, so that we hold people accountable for things that they can change, but we don't hold people accountable for things that are beyond their ability to control.
I suppose, are these the kinds of things that need to happen to close or get rid of the thousands of children who are in care right now? You know, as you know, there are probably more children in care now than there went to residential schools.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why, and for many, many decades, many of us felt we were screaming into silence about this, because we were saying what was happening right now is the crises before us. We have a chance to stop this from happening. That's why the tribunal's decision is really important. I think that when we look forward to kind of reforms in child welfare, we're going to have to see the provinces come on board, but they should be learning from First Nations agencies. Do you know that despite the fact that First Nations agencies have been so underfunded and often not got the support that they needed, they are actually far less likely to remove children than non-Indigenous agencies are. They're much more likely to provide culturally based support, work with extended family, and keep those kids safely in their homes. So I think the provinces have a lot to learn from those First Nations agencies.
I also want to talk a bit about this 1-800 helpline that was set up. I guess, can you explain, it's probably too early to say it's made a difference or not. It was just set up a few weeks ago, but what is it that's set out to do?
Well, you know, with Jordan's principle, a lot of people think it only applies to health, but it doesn't. It applies to education, it applies to early childhood services, health, social services, a whole wide array of things that kids need. So if you're a viewer and you're listening and you're thinking, man, I know a child who needs some of those services, then all you need to do any time of the day or night is call 1-855-JP-CHILD and refer that child for possible coverage under Jordan's principle. The government then has, in a vast majority of cases, a responsibility to get back to you within 48 hours and make sure that child has the services that they need. So everyone should be going to the phones and doing this, because what I've found in Jordan's principle application across the country is we're seeing a lot of healthcare claims come forward, but I suspect there's a lot of kids in need in early childhood and education who would really benefit by receiving these services. And so community members, professionals, folks who love and care for children, you should all be calling that number.
Again, is it too early to say whether this is being effective? Of course, this number was just set up.
That's right. It's just been set up. I've seen some early figures coming out of the government to suggest that people are calling. And I think as people become more aware that this is available to them and that there are time frames that are set by the tribunal that Canada needs to comply with to make sure that kids aren't languishing along while government red tape takes over, then I'm hoping we'll see a lot more calls going into that and kids getting the help they need.
So it sounds like you've been at this for a long time. You're not ready to retire, and the work isn't over yet.
The work isn't over yet. Spirit Bear is still well on the job, because I've always measured change at the level of children, and I don't think we're there yet. I think that we haven't fulfilled the promise that we have for them, which is to make sure that they have a childhood where they're healthy and proud and happy. That's when I'll start retiring.
Okay, well, I'm sure that's still a long ways off. Thank you, Ms. Blackstock, for doing this.
My pleasure.
After the break, the BC provincial budget made a University of Victoria law professor very happy. We'll find out why. Welcome back. This is Nation to Nation. British Columbia's new NDP government presented its first budget earlier this week, and in it came support for an Indigenous law program to be offered this fall at the University of Victoria. This is a first, and it promises to make Indigenous law the bedrock upon which First Nations will govern themselves. Talk about it is one of the program's creators, legal scholar Val Napoleon, who will also be one of the program's instructors. Professor Napoleon, welcome to Nation.
Thank you for inviting me.
So what does having support now from the province mean for the Indigenous law program?
Oh, this is such fantastic news for us. It means we're going to be able to start the program in September. We're going to have the first Indigenous law degree program begin this September. We're going to be accepting 24 students, and we'll have the program up and ready to go.
Now, speaking of the budget earlier this week, no dollar amount has yet come out. How confident are you that this is going to be a long-term, permanent program?
Well, the convention has been that once a post-secondary degree is established, that it's continued unless there's good reason for it not to be. And since this is another law degree, a full-fledged law degree program, we don't see any, we anticipate ongoing support for it. So the budget is what we've requested. It is what is necessary for us to hire faculty and put all the pieces in place that are necessary for the actual implementation. So the budget, technically it's going to start in 2019, but we're going to go ahead through the university and begin it in September.
Now, what is so unique about this particular program? How is it different than, say, Indigenous law that's taught at the University of Toronto or here in Ottawa at the University of Ottawa?
Well, it's a full degree program. So all the first-year subjects, or most of the first-year subjects, will be taught dually. That is, there'll be Indigenous law as part of it, and then there'll be Canadian law. So for instance, I could teach and will teach Gitxsan property law, and I will also teach Canadian property law. My colleague John Burrows will teach Anishinaabe constitutional law and Canadian constitutional law. So the program is over 4 years rather than 3, and what that does is allow us to double up the first-year courses so that students are able to get a full critical treatment of Indigenous law as completely as possible as they would with Canadian law.
You call it the most exciting and vital legal work.
It's not being done anywhere else on the planet. If you just think about it for a minute, most Canadians can send their kids to law school. Most Canadians are assured that their kids can get a law degree and be successful in the world as a lawyer. And for Indigenous peoples, this is the first time anywhere where this has been possible for us as parents, where students can receive a formal degree in Indigenous law that's comprehensive, which will enable them to practice Indigenous law, along with all of the ways that Indigenous law is taught at home and in the communities and so on. But this is the first time that this has been available to our young people and other students who are interested.
How do you expect students who will one day graduate from this program to influence the legal traditions of Canada?
You know what? Indigenous law is already influencing the law of Canada. If you just think for a moment about how Aboriginal title and rights, that law is fundamentally shaped on the idea that Indigenous law and categories of Indigenous law exists. What this will do is allow full consideration in different areas of law of Indigenous principles, Indigenous processes, and doctrine to influence the outcome of cases, so that When problems come up that people want to have considered under Indigenous law, people can look at and draw on Canadian legal doctrine, but they can look at and also draw on Indigenous legal doctrine and legal principles and shape a resolution of the problem through drawing on the wisdom of both of those legal traditions. And what it means is that our legal traditions as Aboriginal peoples will be understood and held up as they should be, as being part of the great legal traditions of the world. There won't be this absence as if Indigenous peoples were somehow lawless, as if our societies and our peoples did not govern ourselves lawfully.
How important is it that there is a place for Indigenous law outside of Aboriginal communities?
You know, the way that we work with Indigenous law critically and philosophically and in other ways, insofar as how is it a part of governance and how is it a part of democracy, how might it make democracy better, how might it make government better, these kinds of questions that we're asking about Indigenous law, critical questions, they need to be asked about the Canadian law by all Canadians. So that's one way that we're contributing to fuller and deeper conversations about things that matter in Canada. The other thing is that, you know, when we teach Canadian law, we draw on, you know, English legal history, and we draw on the history of Commonwealth countries and so on, and social circumstances that gave rise to law and how it developed. Now we can also draw on Indigenous legal histories, Indigenous events and philosophy, and to add to a larger conversation in Canada. You know, when we think about the possibilities of reconciliation, if that is going to mean anything, it has to include Indigenous law. Otherwise, the only law that's in that reconciliation picture is Canadian law.
You brought up reconciliation. I know a lot of critics out there say reconciliation is just the same as colonization. How do you avoid that pitfall, I suppose?
I think it offers an opportunity right now. You know, I heard someone recently talk about a crisis in democracy that we have in Canada. That is a lack of faith in our own country and our own ability to govern ourselves. And there are those same concerns within Indigenous communities. And what we have with this Indigenous law program and with useful and productive conversations, which include standards around reconciliation, is the possibility of creating a public trust in one another. And in order to have that kind of public trust in one another, what we have to have is an imaginary in which we solve problems together. And we also have to have a repertoire of stories where we can solve problems and have solved problems in a way that did not include violence. So these opportunities that we have right now enable us to become better citizens in our own societies. They enable us to be accountable to one another, to take care of one another, and to do so in a way that allows us to be a people in the fullest sense of the word. Like, that's a richness and an opportunity that I think we need to take advantage of, even though there's a possibility that not everything is going to work out.
Well, hopefully it does, and I guess it gets started as early as this September. Professor Napoleon, thank you for being on Nation to Nation.
Thanks for talking to me.
After the break, we speak to a Haida lawyer about an incident in northern BC that can only happen when an international border runs through your nation. Welcome back to Nation. The all-native basketball tournament in northern BC is a huge event there. But earlier this month, 2 players were detained by Canada Border Services. Vinnie Evanshaw and Greg Fisby took a boat from Heidelberg, Alaska to Haida, Gwaii, but didn't report in to Canada Border Services. They were detained and faced a lifetime ban from Canada. Terry Lynn Williams-Davidson is a Haida lawyer. She got them released and got the ban reduced to 1 year. Williams-Davidson joins me now. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
You argued Haida people should not have to deal with Canadian border services. Why?
Well, I just drove from Vancouver to Semiahmoo, where my office is, and I have freedom to do that as a Canadian citizen, in the same way that I have freedom to drive from my home village of Skidegate to my husband's village of Masset, and in the same way that I would have a right to go from the village of Masset to the village of Heidelberg, where my husband was born. In the same way that we all, as Canadian citizens, have freedom of mobility to move within our territory. And so the Haida people migrated, a portion of the Haida people migrated to Southeast Alaska in the 1700s. It's always been our territory. Our ancestors have had freedom of access back and forth across Dixon Entrance and between our villages to attend potlatches, to attend family events, and it's just part of that custom.
If Canada were to, say, ever honor the Jay Treaty, would it solve this problem and we wouldn't have this happen again?
A lot of people are of that view, that would be a good solution. This is not something that we've faced before as members of citizens of the Haida Nation, so that would certainly be a good step forward.
Do you foresee a day in the future, I suppose, when Haida will have the sovereignty to have this invisible border dissolved, where you can move freely back and forth?
If that was in the future, it certainly wouldn't be in the future, in the very near future. The Haida Nation has a constitution, and under that constitution, anyone of Haida descent is a Haida citizen, and therefore these two gentlemen were Haida citizens, and therefore have the right under our constitution to go back and forth within our territory.
Has this been a problem that's cropped up in the past?
Not to this extent, not to have to be placed in jail for the weekend in the way that these two men were.
Why do you think this happened this time around?
I don't know that. And this is not an area of law that I practice in. I am General Counsel for the Haida Nation and work on Aboriginal title and rights issues. But I became concerned because these men were in jail. I don't know of any other instance like that. And I became concerned that, especially with the prospect of facing a lifetime ban and not being able to return to our homeland, that greatly concerned me.
I know in this post 9/11 world, it's gotten harder to cross the international border. I suppose, what can you do so that members of the Haida Nation can go freely, like you said, from their village to another village in their territory?
Well, it certainly is an issue that we, as the Haida Nation, will advocate for going forward, in the way that, say, other people, the Mohawks of Akwesasne, have been working to have this issue addressed. It'll likely be an issue of negotiations between the Haida Nation and Canada in the future.
Okay, well, I hope things worked out, and it seems like they worked out for these two gentlemen. Ms. Williams-Davidson, thank you for talking to me.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcasts. I'm Todd Lamarand. Have a great evening.